session, and just like the first session at the end, just find somebody with a highlighter and hand them your card, and we will check off that you attended this session. If you are applying for CCA credits, we will then share that information with the Nebraska Agribusiness Association, and so that we can get you guys credits for what you guys need. I'd like to introduce you to Laila Puntel at the University of Nebraska. You've been there, this is your third calendar year with the university. She works primarily in the nitrogen studies and research, and she's here to talk to us today about some different nitrogen management strategies that the university is looking at. Laila, I'll let you take over.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming this morning. As Mary mentioned, I'm full-time working as a professor at the university. I work in extension as well, so all what you have seen, you're gonna see here is also presented for growers. I'm trying to integrate research and extension both in the same place. So today I'm gonna cover a little bit about nitrogen dynamic, and just to link those to specific tools, just to kind of have a framework for you. And then I really want to touch base on existing tools and some of the on-farm testing that we're doing, and we have a great opportunity these coming 2 more years for working with growers in any technology that they want to test in their fields. So this is certainly how I feel when I think about nitrogen. And this is a cartoon that I've been using with growers because as a researcher and extensionist and a crop advisor in my past, I feel that way every time that I'm trying to kind of target this economic optimum nitrogen rate, right? We're not only talking about maximizing yields with nitrogen, we're talking about maximizing profit. And the nice thing about that, right, is that if we maximize profit, it's well known that we can minimize losses to the environment. So it's like we have a 2-for-1, right? The grower is getting the benefit, our advisees are getting the benefits, and the environment is getting the benefit. So hopefully, at the end of this talk, I can bring some hope, right, that we are currently having a lot of tools that we can access to have a better idea about what is my economic optimum nitrogen rate in my field. So just to overall, right, to refresh, what is the economic optimum? If you think about your yield, right, as a response of nitrogen, this is my economic optimum considering the price of corn or the price of any commodity, right, and the price of fertilizer. So depending where at, if the prices are better, I'm gonna move towards this side of the curve. If the prices are really bad, right, so if that ratio is really bad, I'm gonna have to be more conservative. So really, you either leave a lot of yield on the table because you're not hitting that right spot, or dollars. So the transformation is equal there. So really, what happened in the research perspective is like we sometimes don't know how this picture looks like in every part of the field, right? Or even for an individual field. So if you think about that, you have a lot of variability in your field, you might be looking at 2 different curves within your same field. So think about the tool of nitrogen that you are currently using, and try to think if you are aiming to that nice spot of economic optimum. So what is our nitrogen rate, right? If you think about it in concepts or agronomic concepts, right? If you think about is literally is whatever my crop is going to demand from nitrogen minus whatever soil or credits are coming from organic matter or whatever residual nitrogen is in the soil, right? So think about the tools in the context of how I'm going to quantify this, if it's going to be soil testing, right, at some portion of the growing season, and then think about your crop demand. So if conditions are being very good, if my field is high potential yielding, that crop demand is going to be high, right? But if we have limitations in the soil, we have weather conditions kind of slowing down the growth, right? Think about your potential is going to be reduced, right? So conceptually, we need to put the 2 pieces kind of together, the demand, but also the soil supply. And so keep this framework in mind as we walk through different tools to see how each of the tools kind of consider the crop demand portion and what is coming from the soil. So, as I say, nitrogen, of course, is one of the most important factors, but really when we look into what factors are affecting this economic optimum, of course we have the market prices, like we talked about it a few minutes ago, but we also have the soil supply and crop demand. Now we are getting into new genetics, right? New management practices, new things that are affecting how much nitrogen is going to be coming from the soil, depending what I did last year or what I have been doing for 5 years, but also crop demand. We have new hybrids coming out in the market that might be more efficient. So think about what are the tools in the future that can consider better genetics or different management or different uptakes during the growing season. So really all these factors is what we are trying to consider in the development of new tools or testing of new tools in the future. And this is a compilation that I always show you to focus on the point that the closer we get to our optimal end rate, the less probability we have of those residual nitrogen to be lost in the environment. So this is a study compiled across the whole Midwest, right? And then what they found is when my difference from my optimal end rate and when I apply is increasing, right, the relationship is almost 1-to-1 from what I apply extra to what it could potentially get lost. So really whatever tool lets you really close to this optimal end rate, that's really our target because it's a win-win. Win for the profit and yields and win for the environment. All right, and this is a concept like when we speak about the 4 R's, right? We kind of cover a little bit of how do we determine the rate, right? But the moment in which we apply the nitrogen is also important. And that's tied to the dynamic of the crop, right? So when we think about nitrogen uptake, right? This is the curve of nitrogen uptake during the growing season. And as you can see, most of the components of the corn plant, really from B6 on forward, that's when they spike, right? So what is that telling you, right? Where do we need to put our nitrogen or make it available? Well, sometime in that period, right? If anything that could happen here, if I apply my nitrogen right here or even before that, well, it's subject to losses or it's subject to risk. Let's put it that way. Depending on your texture, you might have more losses or less losses. But really it's a critical thinking about what can happen until the time in my growing season where I have the high demand, okay? So now looking into that, when we talk about crop demand, right? This is an exceptional year. Let's think it that way. This is a very high potential, you did everything right, you had a perfect planting day, you pick a high yielding hybrid. This is my crop demand. But what happens if you are down here, right? A different field that that has lower potential, or that that you miss something optimal that growing season. So think about this gap, right? We can have any variation between this. Now I'm gonna put it in the other side of the table, right? How much fertilizer uptake I will have, right? And that's when we think about how much in the soil I'm gonna get through the growing season. So when I think about fertilizer uptake, now I can have a very high potential soil, right, that mineralized between 90 to 150 pounds, right? And now I combine it with my crop demand. So that's kind of the two sides of the equation that I was showing to you earlier, right? But then you can have more coarse or lower organic matter soils, right, where I know that I'm gonna get lower potential for that particular portion of the field. So now you see how the two dynamics kind of cross each other, right? I can have high potential with low mineralization sometimes, depending on the landscape position, depending on the field, or the opposite, right? High potential mineralization with high yields. So those two, the demand and the offer from the soil, are kind of determining how much my crop is gonna respond to nitrogen. And really those concepts are kind of leading you towards what's the best tool that we can actually pick for my situation. So, and the situation gets even more interesting, right? Because as I mentioned before, you can have an optimal nitrogen rate in one portion of your field right? And you can think about that. And then another one for a different portion of the field. So think about high fertilizer prices now, high commodity prices. Think about if your next step might be dividing that single end rate that you might have and targeting high potential or high response parts of the field, right? Where I'm gonna get a lot of return for every pound that I put of nitrogen. But then you might identify places that respond like this, where I only need 40 pounds of nitrogen. And I have seen that. I have seen in Nebraska, we are collecting data to kind of show you with examples in regional, in the area, that sometimes respond that way. I know, you might tell me, I don't have the data, I don't know about this, but you have seen the history of yields, and maybe you can have some hints to see if your field is kind of behaving similar way. In any case, if you do a better job at least finding out what was the economic optimum for the entire field, that might give you a step forward from maybe what you are doing today. And something to show you is like, we know that sometimes difference between planting or splitting the application might not be consistent over time, right? So aiming to predict that optimal end rate, but what we know is that the variability, or we are closer with a split application to get to that economic optimum. And the reason is because you have more chances to adjust it. It's a reduction of the uncertainty that you have in making a decision at planting, rather than make it later on where like you know at least 1% of your growing season, right? So it's a matter of risk and balance with your management decisions. All right, so what kind of tools do we have for this? And I'm gonna navigate for a set of tools, and maybe we will stop for a few interactions and questions here. And so empirical based, I mean any kind of end rate calculator, like the UNL calculator, maybe any recommendation that is out there that is an equation based on multiple factors, right? You can think about yields, you can think about organic matter, residual nitrogen in the soil. But then we have three more groups that I want to touch base. The crop growth models, and I'm going to show you one example that we are currently testing in Nebraska, Mason, Adaptin, and also we are working with granular platform with some growers across Nebraska. Crop canopy sensors, long story of testing with the Project Sense work in the state of Nebraska, so kind of summarizing that a little bit. And then of course, pluses and minuses of the soil testing as the unique tool for making management decisions. So this is kind of an overview, and it's more an island for discussion, right? When we think about what tool is the best, or what tool could adjust to your system better, right? And the way that I'm thinking is, could you diagnose which one is your current performance? So how many of you do you know at what nitrogen use efficiency are you operating with your growers or in your farm? Do you know? Like, more or less? You do? Sure. Are you happy with that value? Are you happy with your nitrogen efficiency?
Well, we split ours up about 3 times, so I think we are, but
Excellent.
I don't, that's perfect. But
Sure, but that's a great start. So nitrogen efficiency is one, sometimes they call it partial factor productivity, it's just the inverse of that. And then I'm gonna touch base something about nitrogen balance or surplus, right? It's kind of this idea of nitrogen demand and nitrogen credits from the soil, right? It's kind of the overlook of that. So I also tend to, when I have discussions about what's my next level of technology that I want to adopt, right? I look into my logistics, I look into my machinery. We work with growers that always have been applying in the fall. So then finding a constructor, finding someone that might do a split application, that might be, you know, kind of a hazard or kind of an extra step. And then of course, commodity and input prices. Maybe there is a strategy that lets you better fits considering the context. So what is your next tier of nitrogen tools, right? So as I say, we have farmers that we're working with the on-farm research network that this is what we're gonna test together. How do we transition from a fall to a split application, just to give you like what sense of improvement you have in your nitrogen use efficiency. And I'm gonna go to the other extreme of tools, right? We have growers that were already doing variable rate nitrogen application, and now they come and we're trying to test any other digital ag tool, like granular model, or they wanna test adaptant, or they wanna do something different, or they wanna test sensors, right? So I really like the approach that once you encounter new tools out there in the market, think what is the reasonable step for you to take. Is it just an adjustment on the moment, or is an adjustment in the rate? So think about what tool can lead you to the next step. I feel like more efficient than trying to jump from one situation like this one to something very complicated. I see that, you know, there's requirements of data, there's requirements of just a knowledge and a training of how to input things in a platform, even for how to do a variable rate application, right? So I think a logic transition would be what's your next step and then moving forward. All right, so we talk about nitrogen use efficiency. I think very straightforward, right? So your pounds of nitrogen divided how much bushels you have. And we can argue if that's a good calculation, but it's a really straightforward measurement. We have done it in multiple experiments. It's at least a benchmark, right? So we know that we want to be under 1, under 0.9, because if we look at the balance from those numbers, we know that there's a less residual nitrogen that we can leave in the ground that is subject to losses. So really that's the whole concept, right? And the other way of looking at this is like when we think about how much nitrogen it is removed from the crop, when I'm done with my season, right, I can come back to how much nitrogen I put on, multiply how much nitrogen I remove from my grain, and kind of get the balance between how much did I put on, right, and how much I took off. Work done from some of my colleagues at UNL that actually work closely with Upper Big Blue, they find out that we want to be below 68 pounds of nitrogen. And that has been shown in the literature as a value, right, that can prevent us from major losses. And that's something for you to kind of tune up, right? If you know how much nitrogen you are exporting in grains and you know how much you apply, you can calculate these numbers for your own operation and then say, hey, maybe next year we try something new. So just some options for you to kind of diagnose your own operation. Now, how many of you would like to see this as a tool that you can access into your phone? Like, how many of you would you like to see that? You would like that. You would like that, right? So, because you're busy, right? Doing a lot of other things. You would like to have something at the end of the growing season that tells you, oh, benchmark. Well, so hopefully in the coming year, we could push through something that looks like this way, that is already in an app, that we can actually, you can upload your data or share the data and come up with, you know, some sort of sense, even like aiming to compare your own field, what is your performance. So I think this is the goal, the way that we are going, or the next steps that we are trying to follow, is first, give you tools that allow you to diagnose your operation. And then we move into solutions. All right, so big map here, right? So now let's say that we know that we have room for improvement in our nitrogen use efficiency. Now what we do next, right? So that's kind of the question. So a lot of tools cited here, and the way that we classify it by time of application, grades, type of recommendation. So it's good for you to understand where these tools are coming from, right? So, for example, types of recommendations, we have all the soil tests, model-based, empirical-based. For example, many universities' approaches are in this tool. And then we have, of course, sensor-based models. So we don't have time to talk about all of those tools today, but I'm going to focus just a few of them. So, of course, the UNL calculator, this is something that we start working with growers, try to make them understand how useful it is to incorporate all the credits that are coming from the soil, that are coming from the previous crop. And I just want to go back to the concept of this crop demand and soil offer of nitrogen, right? So when you look at the equation, right, if you see at the components, right, we are considering organic matter, the expected yield, timing, and credits, right? In a simplified way, this equation, what it's trying to do is giving you an idea about what is going to be your crop demand of nitrogen and how much nitrogen you will potentially have in the soil during the growing season. Is as a grower, right, if I don't have a good understanding about my expected yield, or I overestimate what is going to be my crop demand, my end rate is going to be off. So when I hear the two sides saying underestimates nitrogen, overestimates nitrogen, I always try to go back into the inputs. The tool is not going to be perfect. Any tool is perfect. We know that, right? We are under the hands of weather and, conditions, right? So a single equation is not going to be magic. But when it has been tested across the Midwest with data from small plots and on-farm data, the tool on average perform well. So what we know is for the average of the field and doing a good job at putting the inputs, this tool does a good job. Now, for yourself, you can also do the same math that we calculated like a second ago. Once you come up with your nitrogen rate, you can say, okay, what's my nitrogen use efficiency that I'm getting from applying, 250 pounds for my 200 bushels of corn, right? I can do exactly the same calculation and see if I feel comfortable with that efficiency. So some tools for you to kind of keep in mind when you evaluate any tool. Soil tests, I'm not going to get into the details about it, but we have really nice guidance. Soil testing labs across Nebraska have really good indication of how to interpret the data, how to follow the recommendations based on soil testing. So just keeping in mind that depending on the growing season, depending on your soil, right? Soil testing will give you a snapshot of what is currently happening in the soil, right? So just keep that in mind. The more tools you can utilize during the growing season, the less uncertainty we will have making the decision behind the nitrogen. Canopy sensors, very old technology. The first one was the handheld, right? I like them because it gives me a more system or a picture, right, of what's happening in my crop. So basically what I'm doing is using my crop as a tester. It's telling me how much was available in the soil and how good the plant it is or is growing, right? So back in '93, these kind of handhelds were all over the place, and there's local calibrations that you could use to kind of go in B6 and test your crop, right? So that might not lead you to a recommendation right away. It depends on your logistics, depends on your situation. But I do like to use these kind of tools as a grower to either scan your crop or either in some points through this field, go and sense and know how it's performing. So something to keep in mind about this technology, right, is like we always need to compare it with a sufficient place, right? A sufficient spot through the field. So because basically what it's doing is like, okay, this is my spot where I want to test it, how good it could be, right? So then usually growers have to measure a spot that is going to be my reference, and then I go and measure whatever is my question area, right? So that's kind of on the downside, but really we know after walking through the field, we kind of know what areas through the field are really looking good, so that those can be used as a practical way of sensing the crops. So these type of kind of steps are published in our extension books, but if you have questions, we can chat at the end of the day. But really the idea is that you have this tool at least to address how your crop is looking like. And then this is the most sophisticated, or the next level, right? Where now, rather than having handheld sensor, now we have it mounted in the boom of my applicator. So this is what we have been doing for 6 years with these high clearance applicators, testing with growers the performance of these on-the-go canopy sensors. So now, rather than me having to take a lot of measurements, get an equation, and get my end rate, this machine has on board a platform that is transforming in real time my nitrogen stress into a nitrogen rate. Okay, so we have some growers that after testing it adopt the technology. We know that there's value added and more timing of opportunity to apply your nitrogen. So you were mentioned you divide your nitrogen 3 times, right? Well, there's growers that do that using sensors, for example. Or we are testing it with fertigation, trying to determine with sensors, do we need to fertigate or not? Do we weigh more or not? So it's not about the amount sometimes, but sensors can help you to say, do I need the nitrogen or can I wait, basically. So a little bit of overview here. I just want to show you the results that we compiled for the last 6 years. We work across all this area, so really the results are or can be extrapolated to this region as well. More than 80 fields, and the project is going to keep going. So any interested growers, we still having the equipment to give you the opportunity to test the canopy sensors. And really what I liked about them is that we can consider the spatial variability. So the sensors in real time are telling me if I have high yielding areas or low yielding areas, and it's splitting the nitrogen in the field accordingly, right? So are reactive, so I like the way that they are reacting to my crop stage, right? If I compare with other tools early in the planting season, I don't have anything that can guide me in how my season is gonna be, right? So I'm gonna skip this a little bit. Those are just the concepts, but going back to my point, right? How do they work? If you would like to get a handheld or a scanner in your field, basically you need just a reference strip that you know that nitrogen is not limited, right? And then in your target area, dividing the measurements that you get from the scanner, then you know how much sufficiency you have. And that's the input that you need in those equations that we have published in the extension website. You can enter those values and you can get at least a recommendation for that particular field. These are some of the algorithms. Some of them has been commercially available now through AgLeader and some others. So those algorithms that you see right there are incorporated into those systems. So growers don't have to necessarily worry about doing those calculations on the fly. Some considerations when we look at canopy sensors, what we found is that reducing that initial amount of nitrogen, so not exceeding in that pre-planned application, give us the best results if you're already planning on splitting and doing a variable rate or sensor technology. So in my latest analysis of the whole database, we noticed that below 90 pounds, that's kind of, even 75 is what we recommend. 90 pounds is still giving us very good success across different textures, right? For sure, if you are high organic matter, right, we recommend that you reduce that initial pre-planned application. And the reason why is that if I'm thinking that I'm gonna go and take a look at my crop in B6 to B10, right? If I have high organic matter, high mineralization, and I already apply a lot of nitrogen, the likelihood to capture any stress is going to be very low. So for the growers that already apply more than 100 pounds pre-plant, really the success of sensors are not going to be very nice. All right. So really my pre-plant, you know, depending how far I'm going to stand or how much I'm going to wait for that split application, I really want to time up the amount that I'm applying up front. And this is just to give you an overview, just to give you the idea that exists. So for growers that don't want to get the equipment or they don't want to have this applicator, we are using passive sensors, right? So same idea of sensing my crop, now we can mount it in a drone, right? So you might have a provider in the future coming in the area that is giving you these pictures. Well, now we can transform this into a nitrogen recommendation. And it's exciting, right? Because now, with my high clearance applicator or my applicator, I can only enter once to the field. Now with drones, we can get multiple pictures. I can decide, as long as my logistics, right, allow me, I can take multiple pictures during the growing season and make the decision on when to apply. So, and not only that we are working with management zones, right? If you already invested in grid sampling, you have done mapping, you have elevation maps, right? So growers are getting more and more data, right? Even your planter might be collecting organic matter, moisture, right? So think about that. Now a lot of the investment maybe is already done in terms of data. And now we can transform that data in a more informed variable rate application, or even a single application, but with more data than just having maybe a pre-planned assessment. This is just to give you an overview. When we look about all the 80 sites across these 6 years of research, this is the difference in profit between sense and grower. So whatever you see in the top bar is positive. And then difference in nitrogen use efficiency or partial factor productivity. So whatever you see on this sector is good. So really what I want all the growers to be is up here. With all prices, right? We need to update this today. 65% of my growers were in this top quadrant over here, which means increasing profit and savings in nitrogen. So being more efficient, and that was consistent across years, right? We got an average of 30 to 35 pounds reduction on the total nitrogen applied compared to growers when we did canopy sensors, right? And there's two messages there. It's not only about the canopy sensors, but as you say about your nitrogen use efficiency, is the splitting or winning more times to get a shot of nitrogen with more information. So believe me that when we moved the prices here, we were playing around with these, more than 75% of the growers moved to that quadrant. So prices are a good friend for new technology. They highly paid off in scenarios of high commodity prices and high input prices, right? Because any penny or any pound of nitrogen that you can save due to that technology, you paid it off pretty quick. So consistently, right? A lot of research on that has been proven that that's the scenario. Of course, you might tell me, well, but this is not the best time to invest, right? You can tell me that. But maybe it's just about having a custom application, or maybe giving a last shot of nitrogen in season, right? That might be your technology step, like what we were talking before. Just some summaries here. Again, nitrogen use efficiency across 6 years of data, 0.75. Of course, that's the average, right? We have growers that have 0.5, 0.6. And most of those growers were operating already at high nitrogen use efficiency. So I think it's promising, no matter if it's with the applicator, if it's an image, if it's handheld, maybe sensing some parts of your field. The potential is there. Now we need to find out a way that is more friendly for you to adopt it and for you to translate it to growers, if that's the challenge, right? Any question up to that before we follow? Yeah, go ahead.
I noticed you haven't talked about tissue sampling. Is it another tool to use, or is it something you don't think is useful compared to everything else you talked about?
Definitely. I think it's very useful. I gotta be honest that we have been collecting that data for the last experiments that we had, and I would like to put it together with soil testing and some of the other tools to see what is the value added. But I think for the diagnosis of saying how are you performing, sufficient or not, I think they are useful, definitely. But depending where you take it, is like if you can make a decision. What is your experience on?
When I started doing it, I did it just like around tassel time, but I didn't have a reference to see if it was beginning to get efficient, and so I've now, the last few years, gone to getting samples weekly, and then that, I think, has helped show me if I'm in a decline or if I'm still in good shape, rather than just a snapshot of time.
Sure.
A couple times throughout the season.
Sure. And another thing that I sometimes see valuable is if you take it from like a productive area or areas that you know that you have more organic matter. Just to have that benchmark that you're saying. So yeah, definitely. Good. So another idea is like with your fertigation approaches, we're also seeing a benefit of using the sensing or using images. Now that images are being accessible for a lot of growers in platforms, in mobile devices, those images can help you to understand if we have or not to do another round and another fertigation event. So if you have questions about that, if you are interested in testing fertigation based on images, there's a great opportunity for testing that with us as well. So this is kind of the laid out. There's a lot of categories, risk tolerance or risk adverse, that's how we call it. But basically means there's growers that are only one shot of fertigation, and there's growers, right, that might do multiple fertigations during the season. And so risk tolerant, we call it kind of the grower that could do multiple and is willing to wait until we get the confirmation that the crop needs nitrogen. There's others that, no, I know that I want 30 pounds right now. Like, well, so we have two categories of growers, right? But this is crunch recently, so, but I wanted to show you, these are my three categories of managing fertilization or fertigation with images and just drone and pictures from satellites. This is the growers' nitrogen use efficiency, so you can see very efficient growers in general, but you can see a decline. So when I get to manage fertigation with images, there's still room for improving. Why? Because mainly we cut down the number of fertigation events. There's times during the growing season where mineralization is pretty fast, right? Perfect temperature conditions, perfect humidity, and we don't need it. We can delay and save probably one of the applications. So more data coming from all the fertigation sites, but let me know at the end if you're interested on this. All right, so now jumping into crop models. I really want to talk about this in the last few minutes. So platforms, right? Crop models in general, now they're being commercialized, right? They transition into this digital ag area, and now a lot of growers are accessing to this, right? So more inputs into the platform, right? Because now we're talking about soil data, yield history, what's your management, cover crops, manure applications, name it, right? But that's kind of the concept that we touched base at the beginning of the talk. The more information you're able to utilize for your nitrogen management, the less uncertainty we have in deciding that end rate. So this is the trend, right? This is a trend. Data is gonna make us reduce that uncertainty that we have when we make a nitrogen recommendation. So what is a model? It's just a software, right? It's imagining your field as a virtual reality where you can play around with scenarios, right? So I would say, what if you could play around and make a comparison from the past season between a play plant application versus a split application? If you have access to a crop model like Granular or any other software, you can make your scenario by yourself and can have an understanding of what happened into my field. What would it happen if I would plant a cover crop? Like, I think are very educational tools and things that could help us to understand how can we improve, what can we do better. So, not in detail, but they incorporate management, they incorporate my crop, right? Important, genetics, what maturity group I'm using, important to consider. All the soil information, climate in high resolution. Right now, these models are independent of your weather station. They have gridded and high resolution weather. It might not be perfect, right? But every day, these models are simulation what is happening in the soil, what is happening in the plant, and giving you an update as the tissue sample. The tissue sampling that you're doing, right, is a progression. Well, now we can actually simulate it, right? We can know how good the crop is doing and how much nitrogen is left in the soil. So, really good idea. So, looping back into the initial concept of the talk, we have the nitrogen rate, crop demand, crop soil. Simple equations basically are aiming to represent what's going on with the crop demand and the soil nitrogen. Models are doing the same. Adaptant, granular, any of those forecasting tools that you see out there, they're aiming to do a better representation on how much nitrogen I'm gonna need and how much nitrogen is coming from the soil. And I like this part. So models are being set, you can run it per point in your field. You can have a single application, you can make an average, you can run it by zones, or you can run it in a gridded way, and in a less time-consuming fashion. So point base is very fast in platforms, for example, like Adaptant, and I can show you later if you want more details. Polygons, you can import your sorghum data or maybe some yield data that you have previously collected. And then gridded is more data intensive, but if you have been collecting organic matter with your planter, if you already have those measurements, this platform can just take right there the information from your planter and transform it into a gridded map that now we can run the model in each of those grids and give you variable rate prescription. So I hope that I make a really nice transition between a simple equation up to the complexity. Now, it's on you to see where you're at and what's the next reasonable step to show. Marie, how we are doing on time?
We're doing great. Thank you, Laila. Does anybody have questions?
Because I have more to show.
Yeah, we do have time for questions. Oh, you have more to show?
No, I just want to put, I want to put this on the board. Oopsies. Yeah, that one. So we are testing all these technologies that we discussed today. So you have my name, you have my contact, you have Marie to reach out. But you want to test canopy sensors, crop models, inhibitors, biologicals, anything that you think is going to boost you in your nitrogen use efficiency and your profit. We have an opportunity with the NRCS. We're giving compensation to work with us. And also we cover any cost of the technology associated. So if you're going to split apply, we cover the fertilizer cost for that split application. So I think a great opportunity for people that needs some help on using any platform or any software that is out there.